gods as real people, as crazy as it sounds, we actually have some fairly reliable historical sources that mention this, that the gods are ancestors of very real kings, not just in Scandinavia in the Viking Age, but all around Northern Europe. So yes, since the king DNA is in very many of us, since they all had about 20 kids each, then yeah, technically we could all in Northern Europe descend from gods. For example, we have Balder, who is said to be an ancestor of the English kings of Kent and Wessex and some other places in the south of England. At the same time, Balder is listed as an ancestor of the Danish kings in some other sources. Then, of course, we have a few sources mentioning Freyr as a very real ancestor to the Swedish kings, or the Yngling dynasty as it was called, Hothir being a Saxon king in what is now modern-day Germany, and of course many mentions of Odin being a very real ancestor of many kings around Europe at different times. And in other sources that are regarded as very reliable also paint the gods as being certain ancestral figures. There are many sources like this, and they are all very conflicting, and they say different things at different times. In fact, the author of some of the primary texts in the Norse religion and history, he even contradicts himself. In one book, he says that Odin migrated to Scandinavia from Troy or Thracia about 3,000 years ago, and in another one of his books, he came from Ukraine, the Caucasus area, about 2,000 years ago. So I'm not going to go over all of these sources in detail because I've already done other videos on that and it's going to take a long time. But what I'm going to speak about in this video is the possible explanations as to why gods were believed to be very real people, especially when we're always talking about on this channel that the gods are representative of certain forces in nature and divine energies in the universe. Of course, this is confusing, and how do we explain this when they are actually recorded as the gods being real humans? I'm going to tell you. First of all, it's very important to remember that the gods in the myths and the gods in the real historical sources are two very different things. And this is something that these cringe pagans that we always like to make fun of on this channel, that they like to bring these things up. The people who want to believe the myths are real, literal events, and the gods were real, superheroes flying around with their cocks out all over the place. No, the myths are very different than the historical accounts that we have of the gods. For example, Odin in the myths, the prose or poetic Edda, he is said to have traveled to the land of the giants where he meets a giant talking head called Mimir, and Odin cuts out his eye and leaves it in this magical well for infinite knowledge. On the other hand, Odin and Mimir are recorded in a relatively historically accurate old source called Heimskringla. But in here, Odin is a very real king, and Mimir was a counsel to Odin, or perhaps even a religious leader who ended up getting beheaded. And the king Odin ended up preserving this Mimir's head with herbs, and he kept it with him to still benefit from this wisdom of Mimir. That is no different than many other tribal religions around the world believe. So there's a perfect example of how the myths and historical records of the gods are very different from the myths. We cannot forget that. And this brings us to our first explanation, that many of our gods and myths represent very real rituals that shamanic type practices that we humans can actually do. We do know this actually. This is been pretty universally agreed upon by the scholars in the subject, that a few of our myths, not all of them, but a few, describe very real rituals that humans did. There have been a lot of papers written on this, and I'll maybe link some in the description below, where the myths describe a certain ritual, initiation rituals, or some kind of ritual with a sacred drink being served to the hero. And also, this is a common ritual in different cultures around the world. So this is the first explanation, that these supposed ancestors of the kings that we read about in very real chronicles, they did these rituals imitating the gods and the myths and the journeys that they take in the myths. Still, the myths are very symbolic and are over-exaggerated as to actually what happened, not literal events. But yes, for sure, that's one explanation, that these ancestors to kings were real people who were well versed in magic or other spiritual practices, and the myths kind of build upon that in a symbolic and over-exaggeration way. But of course that it makes sense, but to believe that you have to believe a little bit in the supernatural or magical practice, so not for everybody. Anyway, the second explanation is that these gods as ancestors of kings were simply real humans that had the names of their gods, just like a Christian today might call their children Jesus, or a Muslim might call their child Muhammad. Ancient Germanic peoples might have called their children Thor or Odin or Balder or Freya or whatever. It's really not that difficult to see this. This is probably the most logical and most likely explanation for this, since many of these records of the gods as real humans come from a time where we know for sure that the gods were already being worshipped at the time, when we find like runestones or statuettes or historical records that these gods were already being worshipped long before the chronicles say that these gods were, as real humans, actually lived. So very simple, and probably the most likely is that the Norse and Germanic gods were worshipped for many thousands of years before, and sometime in the Germanic Iron Age, somebody named their child after a god, and that child ended up being a very famous king. Very simple, and that can explain all the records that we have as the gods as real humans, pretty much. Anyway, third possibility is that the authors of these real historical accounts of the gods as kings just wrote this on purpose to get people to stop worshipping the gods. Pretty much all of these historical chronicles are written by Christians who had spent hundreds of years by this time with much bloodshed converting the native people of Northern Europe. They wanted to have everyone become devout Christians, and instead of following their own native religion, so it's no secret that these sources cannot be 100% trusted. We know this. So the theory is that these Christian historians writing down these chronicles and sagas put the gods in there on purpose in order to get people from the area to stop worshipping their native pagan gods. Like, hey, look at this story here. Your god is not even a real god. It's just an ancestor of your kings. As a matter of fact, he's an ancestor of this shitty king that I'm about to put in charge of you right now, so you better listen to what he says. But your god was just a regular human. No need to follow your old savage religion. Why don't you convert to our religion and worship the one true God? We know that things like this were done all over the world. We can't be sure that this happened in the north of Europe, but it's a big possibility at least. Option number 4, I spoke about this in another video. These divine energies that we call the gods can actually take human form sometimes. It's not that the actual god is some superhuman, but the spiritual energy that we call a god can possess the spirit of a human for a short amount of time. This is actually what Odin's name means, the possessed one, or the frenzied one, or Lord of the Possessed. This is what Odin means in the myths. It's some spiritual, divine frenzy coming into real humans that we can actually make use of this energy as well. Check out that video I did, link will be below. And this has been believed really all over the world, that through certain rituals, humans working themselves up into a trance or a frenzy, it is believed that a god could be called upon to enter the body of that human for a certain amount of time. Sometimes it's just a few moments during a dance or a ritual or prophecy or something like that. Sometimes it's for many hours during a battle. That's why warriors in old times shouted out Odin's name during battle, so that they believed this frenzy could come in and possess them. Sometimes the divine energy that is a god can possess a human for many years or even a lifetime, making that human to be worshipped as a god. The human itself is not the god, but the energy that is the god somehow enters the human and becomes part of that human for some time in order to do magic practice or change the weather or bring good fertility crops, things like that. Again, these types of things happen all over the world. I'm not saying I believe this. As a matter of fact, I think this is a very dangerous thought to have, that believing that a single human possesses this divine energy and has been possessed by a god. We have seen countless examples in history of this ending up very, very bad. So I'm not saying I believe in this. I don't say you should believe in it either. I'm just saying that humans all over the world believed something like this, and they still do today in some places. So of course it's very possible that the Norse and Germanic peoples of the time believed something like this too. Like Odin was a king who was very good with magic and very wise, or Freyr was a king who had a green thumb. Maybe he had really good luck bringing crops and good harvest to the kingdom and things like that. So that's all I have to say. There are 4 possibilities, just like I said, to explain the gods as real humans. There are a variety of historians that have suggested these types of things. I'll probably link some books and articles below. But guys, let me know what you think too. Do you have any explanations that I didn't go over? I would love to hear. We don't have to always take our ideas from the historians. Your thoughts and opinions are just as valid, as long as it's logical and at least going from what the sources say. This is why I make these videos, so we can put all of our minds together and discover the lost beliefs of our people. So that's all I'll say for today. Vi ses nästa gång.